People love to say Off the Wall was Michael Jackson getting lucky at the right moment, that the stars aligned, that disco was hot, that the industry was ready. But none of that explains how a 19-year-old, coming off a childhood spent in the spotlight, suddenly delivered one of the most precise, confident, and influential albums of the era. This wasn't a gamble, it wasn't an experiment, and it definitely wasn't an accident. Because when you look at who Michael teamed up with, how the album was built, and the level of control behind every single decision, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Off the Wall was designed to succeed. Michael Jackson wasn't starting from zero. By the time Off the Wall began taking shape, Michael Jackson wasn't an untested solo artist. He was already one of the most experienced performers in the world. From the age of 5, his life had been structured around rehearsals, recording sessions, live television, and international tours with the Jackson 5. By his late teens, Michael had already performed in sold-out arenas, appeared on countless television specials, and learned firsthand how hit records were built, marketed, and sustained. That level of exposure gave him an instinct most young artists simply don't have. But experience didn't equal freedom. At Motown, Michael's solo output was tightly controlled. Song choices were limited, production decisions were made above his head, and his artistic growth was treated as a risk rather than an opportunity. Meanwhile, his voice was changing, his musical taste was expanding, and his obsession with perfection was intensifying. Michael studied contemporary R&B, funk, disco, and pop records relentlessly, paying close attention to groove, bass movement, and vocal phrasing. He wasn't guessing what would work. He already knew. At just 19 years old, Michael was also acutely aware of the industry's history with child stars. He had watched others fade the moment they tried to mature. That fear sharpened his focus. Off the Wall became about credibility as much as success. He wanted records that could live in clubs, dominate radio, and still age well. This is why the album doesn't sound like a teenager trying to reinvent himself. It sounds like an artist with a clear identity finally being given room to execute it. And once Michael found collaborators who respected that vision, the transformation accelerated fast. The meeting that changed everything. The turning point didn't happen in a recording studio. It happened on a movie set. In 1978, Michael was cast as the Scarecrow in The Wiz, a project that placed him alongside industry veterans and exposed him to a very different creative environment. That's where he crossed paths with Quincy Jones, who was supervising the film's music. Quincy wasn't starstruck. He watched how Michael worked, how he listened, how he asked questions, how he absorbed information. What stood out wasn't talent alone, but discipline. Michael made it clear he wanted Quincy to produce his next album, but Quincy didn't agree immediately. He tested Michael's seriousness, pushing him on musical knowledge, influences, and long-term vision. Michael passed every test. He spoke fluently about arrangements, harmony, and rhythm, and he knew exactly what kind of record he wanted to make. Something sophisticated, rhythmic, and timeless. Quincy later admitted he was shocked by how much Michael already understood about music construction and studio process. That mutual respect became the foundation of Off the Wall. Quincy wasn't there to control Michael. He was there to refine him. He saw an artist who needed structure, honesty, and collaborators who wouldn't waste his time. And once Quincy committed, he opened doors Michael had never been allowed to walk through before. From that moment on, Off the Wall stopped being a solo project and started becoming something far bigger. A carefully assembled operation built to last. Assembling a team built for precision. Once Quincy Jones committed, the next move was ruthless selectivity. This wasn't about surrounding Michael with big names for credibility. It was about building a team that could execute at the highest possible level. Quincy approached Off the Wall the same way he approached film scores. Every contributor had to serve the overall sound. Ego had no place in the room. If something didn't elevate the record, it didn't make the cut. One of the most important additions was Rod Temperton, a relatively unknown writer at the time, whose instincts were frighteningly sharp. Rod had an unusual ability to write melodies that felt instantly familiar without sounding recycled. His songs were structured with mathematical precision, tight verses, explosive choruses, and hooks that stayed lodged in your head. Quincy recognized that immediately and gave him space to work closely with Michael, shaping songs around Michael's vocal strengths and rhythmic instincts. Behind the scenes, the production and engineering team were just as critical. Quincy insisted on clean, punchy mixes that let every instrument breathe, especially the bass and percussion. Vocals were recorded with obsessive attention to detail, often requiring multiple takes to capture the exact phrasing Michael wanted. This wasn't about chasing trends. It was about clarity, balance, and repeatability. Every song had to sound just as good on a club system as it did on the radio. What made this team dangerous was alignment. Michael had vision, Quincy had structure, Temperton had melody. The engineers had discipline. Off the Wall wasn't created by chance collaboration. It was built by specialists who understood exactly what kind of album they were making. And with the foundation locked in, the next layer would give the record its unmistakable groove. The musicians who gave the album its pulse. What separated Off the Wall from most late 70s pop records was that it felt alive. That wasn't accidental. Quincy Jones insisted on using elite session musicians who could lock into a groove with absolute precision while still keeping the music loose enough to breathe. At the center of that sound were the brothers Johnson, whose influence shaped the album's rhythmic identity from the ground up. Louis Johnson's bass work in particular became the backbone of the record. His playing wasn't just supportive, it was melodic, aggressive, and perfectly synchronized with the drums. Tracks like Don't Stop Till You Get Enough moved because the bass led the song, not because it followed it. This approach gave Off the Wall a funk credibility that many pop disco records lacked, allowing it to dominate both dance floors and radio without sounding disposable. The rest of the musicians were chosen for the same reason: control. Tight drummers, disciplined keyboardists, and guitar players who understood restraint. Nothing was overcrowded. Every instrument had space, which made Michael's vocals cut through effortlessly. Quincy blended live performance with studio polish, making sure the record sounded clean, but never mechanical. That balance is why the album still feels modern decades later. This wasn't disco chasing a trend. It was funk, pop, soul, and rhythm fused by musicians who knew exactly when to push and when to pull back. And once that groove was locked in, Off the Wall wasn't just a strong album. It was impossible to ignore. But the final touch would come from someone who understood melody and emotion at the highest level. Stevie Wonder's quiet but powerful influence. Bringing Stevie Wonder into the Off the Wall orbit wasn't a publicity move. It was a creative statement. Stevie was already regarded as one of the most advanced musical minds in the industry, known for complex harmonies, unconventional song structures, and emotional depth. His involvement immediately elevated how Michael was perceived behind the scenes. This was no longer a former child star experimenting with disco. This was an artist being taken seriously by the best in the business. Stevie contributed songs that pushed Michael beyond straightforward pop phrasing. His writing demanded control, precision, and emotional nuance, forcing Michael to lean into his vocal maturity rather than youthful energy. The melodies were tighter, the chord progressions richer, and the songs required restraint as much as power. That balance helped redefine Michael's voice for an adult audience. Smoother, more confident, and more expressive than anything he'd released before. Just as important was what Stevie represented symbolically. He didn't work with artists he didn't respect. His presence signaled to the industry that Michael belonged in the same creative tier as elite musicians, not novelty acts. That validation changed how Off the Wall was received internally before it ever reached the public. By the time the album was finished, Michael wasn't just surrounded by talent, he was being sharpened by it. And when the record finally hit the world, the response proved that this level of craftsmanship couldn't be ignored. The moment the industry had to take him seriously. When Off the Wall was released, the reaction was immediate and impossible to downplay. The album didn't just perform well, it rewrote expectations. 4 singles broke into the top 10, something no solo artist had achieved from a single album at that point. Each track landed in a different space: radio, clubs, R&B charts, proving this wasn't a one-lane success. Michael had crossed over without losing identity, and the industry noticed fast. Award season sealed it. Off the Wall earned major Grammy recognition, including a win that confirmed Michael wasn't being graded on potential anymore. He was being judged on results. What made the moment more striking was the contrast. This was Michael's first true adult solo album, and it had already outperformed careers that had been carefully built over decades. Critics who once spoke about him cautiously were suddenly forced to recalibrate their language. Behind the scenes, labels began studying the album like a blueprint. The production, the sequencing, the balance between groove and melody, it all became reference material. Michael Jackson was no longer a former child star making a comeback. He was a leading force shaping where pop music was heading next. And while most artists would treat this level of success as a peak, for Michael and Quincy, it was something else entirely. Proof. Proof that the formula worked, and proof that what came next could be even bigger. Looking back, the idea that Off the Wall just worked doesn't hold up. Every major element was deliberate. Michael wasn't discovering who he was. He was finally being allowed to execute a vision he'd been developing since childhood. At 19, he already understood the mechanics of hit records, live performance, and audience psychology better than most veterans. What he lacked before wasn't talent or discipline. It was control. Quincy Jones provided structure without limiting creativity. Songwriters like Rod Temperton delivered material designed for longevity, not trends. Musicians brought groove without sacrificing precision. Even the sequencing of the album was intentional, balancing energy with restraint so the record never burned out. This wasn't a collection of songs. It was a unified statement built to last. Most importantly, Off the Wall proved something Michael would carry into every project that followed. Success wasn't about chasing the moment, it was about shaping it. The album didn't just set him up for what came next. It taught him how to dominate an industry on his own terms. And once that lesson was learned, the ceiling disappeared entirely.